Chinese leaders are reportedly considering a mandatory cap on coal use to reduce smog and greenhouse gas emissions. China's unprecedented rate of development has been enlarged, powered by coal-fired energy, with a lot of it coming from Australia.
Now, details of some of the plans have not been released in public, but it's surely got the attention of Australia's coal exporters and, of course, our politicians. So to help decipher what this all is going to mean to Australia, we're joined by energy analyst and founding partner of Houston Kemp economist Greg Houston himself. Greg, thank you for coming in.
Good evening.
Really interesting, this news that is filtering out of China, and I guess the details are fairly scant. This plan is going to be linked, what, to economic growth?
The idea, or at least what's discussed, is to cap the coal use according to the rate of economic growth, but details are sketchy, so it's very difficult to say exactly what it's going to mean in practice. But I think it's really important to understand just how big an influence China is in the world coal consumption. It uses half of the world's coal supply each year, just at the moment. So capping that would have a big effect on the development of the coal market.
Just quickly on those figures, do we know what rate it's growing, its use of coal is growing at the moment, to sort of try and compare?
Well, you can get a feeling for it. Most of the coal is used in electricity generation, and the electricity generation system in China has doubled in size in the last 10 years. It's due to double again in the next 20 or 25 years. So if things just stay as they are, that coal use is going to expand very dramatically. If it's capped, that changes things a lot.
One thing that's really interesting is that they've gone for this capping coal use rather than capping emissions, which was Australia's plan. What's the difference there?
Well, one of the problems with capping emissions, they're very difficult to measure emissions because they come from all sorts of different sources. So focusing on coal, it's the single biggest source of emissions, and it's much easier to measure coal use than it is to measure emissions production. So there's some good sense in that. And also the focus of the electricity industry, which is the big user of coal, that's also it's very easy to monitor.
What is it going to mean for Australia without being too parochial? Because, of course, we are a big provider of coal.
We're a huge provider of coal. We have about nearly 20% of the world market. China uses 50% takes 50% of the world market. Coal prices have already been under pressure for the last 2 or 3 years, as actually due to the increasing participation in that market by the US. So the US has never been a coal exporter until 3 or 4 years ago. It's facing a domestic gas surplus, so it's dumping its coal onto the world market. So prices are already been falling quite a lot from where they were 2 or 3 years ago. So a change in the outlook for China is going to add to that pressure in the downward pressure in coal prices.
Economically, what does it mean for China? Because that's also a measure we look at very closely here in Australia, about how well their economy is doing and how much demand there is for our resources.
Well, it's a huge challenge to grow because growth needs more energy consumption. And the question is, if you want to keep growing, you need to have more energy supply, but where's that going to come from? So the big challenge for China is what alternative energy sources will it be able to rely on?
Well, they're quite progressive with, solar, wind, wave energy and all that kind of thing. How are those projects looking at coming online? Are they able to come on sooner?
Well, the technology is still quite cautious in terms of the role that those things can play. They have some role, but China is just such a huge user of energy that renewables alone just cannot supply what it needs. So the logical alternatives would be gas, and it doesn't have its own gas supply yet in China to any great extent, but there's some prospects for that ready to develop.
But that's the thing, the emissions from gas are quite substantial as well, aren't they?
That's true, but they're more or less half what the emissions are from coal. So just a shift from coal to gas is very helpful for the emissions, and it's much both the greenhouse gas emissions, it's about half, and also the particulate emissions into the atmosphere, which is all of the problems in Beijing. Gas is a much cleaner fuel. So that's a big possibility, but China has to develop its shale gas reserves before it can really have a serious reliance on that. The other source they can look to is uranium and nuclear energy, which is a controversial but a great baseload energy supply which you need to use. You need to do something to use in conjunction with renewable sources. So that actually has some good things for Australia, because We're producers of not just coal as energy, we have a big uranium producer, and also we're becoming a very, very big gas producer. So there's some upside for other producers of energy in Australia, but
there could
not,
be short-term
not the
pain
coal.
for others, indeed. What does it say too more globally? Of course, we've seen President Obama really trying to take action on this issue in his final term, and now China is, even though it might be in a slightly different way. And here in Australia, of course, we're almost in an energy, well, certainly a carbon reduction sort of vacuum at the moment.
Well, the strong theme in world energy is the much reduced appetite for coal because of it's the worst offender in terms of greenhouse gas pollution. So we've seen the US adopting a target of having a 30% cut or 30% renewables a target by 2030, which is going to displace coal even more. And now we're seeing a similar theme emerging from China, as indeed we have already in place in Australia. So coal is, if you like, yesterday's fuel, even though there are still serious energy growth demands to be met in China and elsewhere.
What's the public perception behind all this? Because, you know, you mentioned the controversy around uranium, the mix of gas and renewables. What's the public perception in terms of propelling that sort of political action?
Well, I think that there is this public perception is greatest in terms of distaste for coal. I think perhaps less appreciated is the huge benefits of shifting to gas because of its much lower greenhouse gas properties. And of course, uranium will remain a very controversial figure, and it's hard to see that going away. I mean, a really good example of that challenge is in Japan, where following the Fukushima disaster, Japan shut down its nuclear energy system, and it was a very big relier on nuclear power. It's had to replace that in the last 3 or 4 years with gas, and it's bought a lot of that gas from Australia, and that's one of the reasons why our gas exporters have been able to enjoy such high prices for gas, is that switch away from nuclear.
Really interesting
Japan.
to watch this one, Greg Houston. Thanks for coming in.
Thank
really
you.
Good to talk to you.